This is a Witch SK650 that I bought with the intention of using it to clean up and regrade after grinding stumps, and I'm sure lots of other various uses. I may have overbought a little bit because this thing is quite a bit bigger than it looked in the pictures, but I'll just consider that a good problem. What is definitely not a good problem is this boom arm being bent. If I hold a straight edge up to it, it should be pretty obvious. It is bent just a little bit. You can see how it doesn't match up with the quick attach plate, as opposed to this side, which is straight like it's supposed to be. I have no idea how that could have happened because that's like 1.5 inch thick piece of solid steel, and I'm kind of disappointed in myself for not noticing that until I got it home. But I guess there's no use in crying over bent boom arms, so I'm just going to figure out a way to bend it back. I did notice that this bushing was missing out of the quick attach plate right here, but I saw quite a few of these that had the same problem, so I didn't really think anything of it. What I have done is welded a piece of bar stock to this side of the boom to hopefully stiffen it up. And then I've got a hollow ram with a piece of threaded rod run through it over to the other side, and I'm gonna try to just bend this side in. That looked like it was working, but this side was bending more than I was comfortable with, so I kind of jammed this bar in here diagonally like that to hopefully keep this from going anywhere. The distance between the pin bosses here is exactly right, but there's still just a little bit of a bow in this piece. So I'm going to try to push it out with this bottle jack. I've got the bottom cylinder just snug so that I can hopefully push that out without changing the distance there. Had to swap jacks out real quick. That little 6-tonner just wasn't getting it. Okay, I am satisfied that these lift arms are both straight and parallel with each other and the rest of the machine. Unfortunately, at some point while I was working on it, I realized that both of the pin bosses are crooked somehow. This one is visibly twisted this way, and the other one is also off, although it's not very obvious unless you look really closely at it, but it is crooked as well. I have no idea how that's possible unless someone replaced these and welded them back on crooked at some point. I'm sure the factory didn't do that. In any case, I am just going to ignore that for right now and turn my attention to the quick attach plate. So this middle bore and that bore are fine. That one had a bushing in it that I took out, but this bore was run for some time with no bushing in it, and it is worn quite badly. I don't know if you can tell, this side is thinner than this side, and this is the pin out of it. You can see the wear on it. So the only way I know to fix that is to weld the bore up and then bore it back out to the correct size. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I went ahead and cleaned it out with a die grinder and a sanding wheel. Got everything down to shiny, clean, bare metal so that I can weld on it. And I'm just going to start laying beads in and building it up. Got that all welded up. Actually went back and ran a few more beads in it off camera because I was worried there might not be enough. But I just did that with ER70S6 MIG welding wire, which is like common garden variety MIG wire that you could get anywhere, and 25 CO2 75 argon mixed gas, which is also extremely common. So the next thing I need to do is get the boring bar set up in these holes. So like I mentioned, this bore is fine, so I want to reuse it. So I made a bushing out of some scrap aluminum that just sits in there kind of loose like that, and that will locate the boring bar to this bore. And then this is the bar I'm going to use. This is a piece of 1-inch diameter 1045 TGP shafting material. So it's 1045 steel that is turn, ground, and polished. It is extremely straight and extremely concentric. It's intended for like drive shafts and machines and what have you. The only thing I did to it is bored out this end and pressed in a cheap 12-point socket that I had lying around, and then cross drilled it and put in a roll pin to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So that should go through the bushing just like this. Oops, well, do this here. Okay, something like that there. And what I've already done is just held a piece of flat stock up to this flat machined surface here and here, kind of like that, and then measured the distance between the stock and the bar. And then I cut some wooden blocks corresponding to those distances. And then on this end, I just lightly tack welded some pieces of flat stock onto those same surfaces. That way, I should be able to put these blocks in, just like this. And let's see, I think that one went like that. Kind of like that. And in theory, at least, that should have the bar on this end in exactly the same position as on that end. So now what I'm going to do is take this other bar that I drilled a 1-inch hole in and slip it over the boring bar like that. Oop, I'll have to, let's see, do it like this. And get this all set up, and then just tack weld this onto the pin boss to give myself a false bore, so to speak, and then that will hold the bar securely while I mount the bearing holders that it will actually ride in while it's turning and cutting. Got the bearing holders welded on. I just used random chunks of mostly threaded rod that I really had no other use for. And they're just made out of some large channel iron that I found at the scrapyard and drilled holes in to mount some self-aligning flange bearings. Hopefully this will be strong enough. It'd be really bad if this comes loose while it's cutting. I think it'll be alright. This one I welded on a piece of steel plate to give a mag drill a good purchase, because that's what I'm going to use to drive the boring bar. But before we do that, I need to put these bearings in. Should go something like that, and then I'll bolt those down. Now I can break this off and pull this bushing out. As I mentioned, I'm driving the bar with a magnetic drill press, so that is attached to the bearing holder, and then power is transferred to the bar through these two 3/8 drive socket wrench universal joints that I hooked together to make a little drive shaft to account for misalignment between the drill and the boring bar. So the last piece is the cutting bit that I made out of a 1/4-inch diameter piece of high-speed steel drill blank. Just ground a single point cutting edge on it like you would for a lathe tool. Ground a little flat for a grub screw to push against and hold it in there. And I drilled a hole in the bar and then cross-drilled it for that set screw. So that should just go in there kind of like that, and then I'll put the set screw in and get the height set where I want it and try to take a cut. Here goes absolutely nothing. The weld is harder than I thought it was going to be. It started cutting just a little bit, but not very well, and then I broke the bit. So I'm going to try and heat it up red hot with a torch and just let it cool and see if that softens it any. Probably not, but I can't really think of anything else to do right now. It's all cooled off. I ground a new bit and put it in there. So, take two, I guess. Okay, doesn't look bad at all actually. I thought that would be all chewed up. Can't really see in the bore. I am gonna call this a complete failure. Well, maybe not a complete failure, because I do feel like I learned something, but the fact of the matter is this weld is too hard for me to cut. No matter what I do, every time the tool touches it, it just immediately blunts, and then it's just rubbing a dull piece of high-speed steel on it and not cutting anything. I don't think there's anything wrong with my tool. I grind single point tools all the time to use on the lathe, and they work fine. It's a relatively simple thing to do. I know how to do it a lot. It's just not working to cut this weld. After some research, what I think is the case is that this plate is actually made out of some form of cast iron or something that has a high enough carbon content to where it was absorbed into the weld puddle and caused it to harden. I assumed this plate was cast steel when I started with this plan. I have no idea why I assumed that, I just did. And I assumed cast iron would not be strong enough for this application, but I really am not exactly sure what I'm talking about. I just know this weld is too hard. Furthermore, it seems like it's getting harder the deeper I go, the more I cut out. The first few passes went fine. The tool cut it no problem, but eventually I got to the point where it would just blunt it almost instantly. I mean, I might have gotten like one revolution out of it. I mean, you can see the horrible surface finish that it was leaving on what it was cutting. Now, I'm sure people will say just use a carbide tool to cut it, and that I don't think will work because this setup is not rigid enough to use a carbide tool. In this case, it's a 1-inch diameter bar trying to cut a 2-inch diameter hole, and it's only supported at either end, and the ends are held on with a bunch of scrap metal I welded up. Actually, out of sheer desperation, I did find a little carbide boring bar, like for a boring head, and cut the base off of it and jammed it in here and tried to cut it with that. And it did cut it just a little bit, but it still had kind of the same problem. It had a ton of chatter, and about halfway through the hole, it actually just broke, as you see there. So there may be some way to anneal this, but it would probably involve heating up the whole piece and then cooling it in a very controlled and very slow manner, which I don't really have the means to do. It's such a shame because if it weren't for this weld being harder than coffin nails, I mean, this would work fine. If you were just cutting through regular steel, it would work great, but it will not cut this. So I am going to go lick my wounds and figure out something else. I figured it out. Spending a pile of money is probably my least favorite way to solve a problem, but sometimes it's the only way. I just happened to find a brand new quick attach plate that fits this machine on eBay. So $430 some, and about a week and a half later, here it is. As you can see, it's shipped bare, so we'll have to install all the parts it needs. I've got some new stuff and some old stuff left over that I'll reuse. I'm just trying to look it over right now and make sure it's the same as the old one in all the ways that it needs to be. The only thing I'm noticing is that this, where this pin mounts, looks a little bit wider, and I don't know, I'll have to measure it. It almost looks like the bore is smaller, although it shouldn't be. But other than that, it looks almost identical, other than being thicker in some areas, so that's cool. Maybe it's a little bit stronger. The first thing I'm going to do is install these bushings here. Ditch Witch is kind of weird. They use these composite bushings. I don't know what they're actually made out of, but they look kind of like fiberglass or something. They also don't use any grease. There's no grease fittings on any of the bucket linkage, so I don't know if these are supposed to be self-lubricating or exactly how that works. But I guess we'll find out. Very important to get these started straight, so you're not pulling on them sideways. That's all I'm going to do to the quick attach plate just right now. I've got some other parts to go into it, but we'll do that later. The next thing I need to work on is actually replacing these pin bosses. As I mentioned before, they're both crooked. As you can see, I've got a metal rod run through this one, and it should line up with this hole, but it doesn't. I can wiggle it around a little bit, but as you can see, it's really not even close there. And if I put it in this other side, you can see it's just as bad, if not worse. Kind of wiggle it around there. I mean, this rod is not the straightest thing in the world. It's just a piece of hot rolled bar stock, but it's so far off. It's definitely not just like the bar being bent. So I have made some new pin bosses on the lathe to replace these. So I'm going to cut these off, or more specifically, I'm going to gouge the welds off all around here. And then I'll put these new ones on, get them lined up how they need to be, and weld them on solid. Also, I recently noticed this humongous crack where this piece here welds to the rest of the boom. I'm assuming I must have done that whenever I was pushing on it to straighten it. Seems like I would have heard that, but I don't know. It's there and it needs to not be, so while I'm at it, I will go ahead and gouge that out and weld it back up, and hopefully that'll take care of it. But doing all that will be way easier if I can do it in position, so I think I'm just going to take the boom arms off the rest of the machine. That way I can flip them around as needed. I went ahead and took the hydraulic lines off. That was just a matter of taking out some screws, and then I flopped them over to the back of the machine here so they'll be out of the way. Now I think if I just knock out this pin and this pin on each side, I should be able to pick the arms up and off. I got the old bosses gouged off and got everything cleaned up with an angle grinder, ground all the slag off. That was a little tricky. I don't think I've ever actually gouged anything before. You kind of have to creep up on it until you find the line right where the weld ends and the parent metal begins. And then if you cut right exactly on that line, the parts will separate. Just took me a little while to figure that out and do it. But that looks good, so now I'm going to weld up this crack and then get everything as copacetic as I can and weld the new bosses on. For some reason the ground cable on this plasma cutter is a lot shorter than the torch, and I needed more reach, so I just extended it with a piece of, I think this is like audio cable for a car. But that worked fine, and that was so much easier than trying to grind those things off. I don't even want to think about trying to cut those off with a grinder. I'd have been here forever. Here's what's going on with this. I've got the back of the boom sitting on its pins in these V-blocks on this flat aluminum plate on the floor. If you come up here, I've got the quick attach plate sitting flat on the floor on a machined surface. The front is machined flat, so that's fine. And I've got it squared up to the pins in the back, or nearly squared up. I think it's off by like a 1/16 of an inch right now. You can see this side has a small gap between the boom and the pin boss, but this side has a much larger gap. I'm not sure, that's probably at least a 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch, something like that. It's huge. So I'm trying to figure out why that is. I'm confident the floor is not that uneven. There's no way it takes that big of a dip from right there to right here. So the only two things I can think of are that either the boom arms are not parallel with each other because the boom is twisted. My other idea is that whoever replaced these pin bosses last cut them off unevenly and cut more off of this side than they did off that side, which seems a lot more likely to me. I messed with this a bunch more and I think I finally got it where I want it. So what I did is leveled this plate. It was actually not level. I stuck some of this strapping stuff underneath it to shim it up, and I've got it as level as I can. Spin the level around. Still pretty good. And then go to this end, put some metal rods in these machined holes in the plate here. And if I set the level on those, you can see it's also just about perfect. So that end should be as level as this end. And then I measured from the end of the V-blocks that are holding the pins up to this machined surface here, and same thing on this side, and they're exactly the same, and all 4 corners are touching. This one is still a little bit light, but it is resting on there, so that should work. I did have to grind off a little bit on each end. I've got the gap on this side closed up pretty well. There's a little bit of a gap on this side, but nothing that should be a problem, I don't think. So I'm going to take the welder and just go around and put lots of small tack welds on these, hopefully in such a way that they won't pull and get all distorted. And then once I have them secured pretty well, I'll get it attached permanently. Came out really good. I ended up running a few more beads over everything off camera. I was just going to do one, but I figured while I had the welder out and I was doing it, better safe than sorry. I went a little overboard right here, so I just ground that down, and I'm sure some paint will hide it just fine. It's interesting too, because you saw how I had it up on its side, and every time I would run a bead of weld, I would turn the quick attach plate, and if there was more weld on one side than the other, it would bind up just a little bit. But as long as the welds were symmetrical, it would turn freely. And it's just kind of crazy to me how one little bead of weld can pull that hard, even on pieces this thick. This is a little cold for some reason, but that's okay. Other than that, I'm super happy with how that came out. I was really worried about messing that up. So this is ready to go back on the machine. However, and I know this will come as a shock, I found another problem. The base end of the boom lift cylinders here on both sides is worn out. This is the piece of the bushing that was left. It was sitting in there like that. And you can see where the cylinder is egged out a little bit. And worse than that, it has worn into this pin. And this pin is not replaceable. It is welded to this plate, and then this plate is welded onto the rest of the frame. So I am not sure what I'm going to do about that. It's not worn much, but it's worn enough to where if you just tried to put another bushing in it, I'm sure it would just hammer it and smash it out in no time. So I think I'm going to work on fixing the cylinder ends, and hopefully while I'm doing that I can think of a way to fix these pins. Let's see if I can get this cylinder off of here without making the biggest mess in the world. I'm kind of once bitten, twice shy on the whole welding things up and boring them out idea, so I have run a bead of weld on an inconspicuous part of the base of this cylinder, and I'm gonna try and cut it off with the boring bar to make sure that it's still machinable, and then go from there. Alright, that seems like it worked okay, so I'm actually going to get this set up so that I can bore the hole out bigger to clean it up and true it up, and that way I won't have an extremely thin layer of weld in the areas, which is not ideal. I'll do that, then weld the bore up, bore it back out to the correct size for the bushing, and we should be good. That came out pretty good. The camera battery died, but right after that I faced off each side just to kind of clean it up. I think I did cut a slight taper into it somehow. It's a few thousandths bigger on one side than it is on the other, so I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but I don't think it'll really matter anyway. I'm going to put this bushing in it. I'm actually not exactly sure what this is. I bought it from McMaster because it was the strongest self-lubricating bushing material that they had on their site. It said it was a bronze iron alloy that is impregnated with like 90 weight oil. So I'm not sure how that works, but it is quite oily. It oiled up the bag that it came in. And it occurred to me that all the other pivot points that use those composite bushings have them riding on a chrome plated steel pin, whereas this one will be riding on just a regular non-plated piece of steel. So I thought this might work better, and also I think it's a little bit bigger than the Ditch Witch bushings, so hopefully it'll fit better in this bore that I think I cut a few thousandths oversize. But anyway, I'm going to press that in and keep moving right along here. The next thing to do is address the wear on this trunnion here. I do have a plan in mind on how to do that, but the first thing I want to do, kind of just for posterity if nothing else, is see how much it's actually worn. Let's see, so I think, let's see, the nominal diameter is 1 1/4 inches. Yeah, that's what it is on the unworn part. And then on the worn, looks like 1.22, get bigger, 1.19, 1.1, yeah, so 1.22, well, that's getting smaller actually. It's worn more. 1.21, so it's worn about 40 thousandths, give or take. The very first thing I want to do is use this guide that I made out of a piece of plastic and a drill bushing to drill and tap a 5/16 by 18 hole, hopefully exactly in the middle of the trunnion here. I'm going to use this tap that I cut off flush as a bottoming tap to get threads all the way to the bottom of the hole. It's actually a tap that I broke and then cut off. That looks good, so now what I'm going to do is just put a little bolt in this hole to close it up and keep any grinding dust or anything from getting in there. I've got this rubber floor mat here to hopefully protect this plastic gas tank from any welding spatter, so now I'm gonna build up this worn surface with weld. Alright, I've got that ground down as far as I dare. I actually went too far and had to build it back up some, and I might have gone too far again, but anyway, we'll find out in a second. What I'm going to do now is use this hole that I drilled before and thread in this bar. This is actually my boring bar that I made earlier. I just drilled and tapped the other end of it. I'm going to use a bolt with the head cut off as a stud. Thread this in like so, tighten it up, and that rod is intended to hold this contraption that I made. So just a couple pieces of steel, this one on the bottom I cut up and bored out and put a bushing in that fits snugly over the rod, and then this top part is split into two and it's bored out to hold the neck of that die grinder. So the idea is I can clamp the die grinder in here and then slide this over the rod, and that should allow me to grind this surface straight and true. Hopefully. I'm still not sure that this is going to work, but let's find out. This did not work. This grinder is not powerful enough. It doesn't have enough torque to really take much of a cut with this relatively large wheel here. And to cut effectively, this flat disc needs constant pressure, which you can't apply if it's held fixed in a jig like this. And I kind of don't think this was rigid enough. It seemed like it wanted to flex a little bit around this plastic bushing. I don't know, I couldn't really tell, but it just wasn't working. It was just rubbing and wearing down the wheel and not actually cutting anything, and I couldn't really figure out a way around that. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with this. What this is are the bearings that I had from earlier. I bolted those together, and then I bolted a door hinge onto those, and then I bolted this angle grinder onto the door hinge so that it will pivot like that, and I can control the depth. And to control it accurately, I drilled and tapped a hole in the bearing housings and threaded in a little jam bolt that I made by gluing a ball bearing into the end of a regular bolt. And then I've just got some little bungee cords hooked to it here to pull it tight against the work and apply a constant pressure so you don't have to try to hold it. And then on this end, I've just got a piece of scrap metal attached to it to balance it. That way it doesn't change when it's on top or on bottom. And I welded a piece of metal to it here to act as a handle so I can control it easier. And as unbelievable as it is to me, I think this is actually working. I welded this back up again, and I've been slowly grinding it down, and it's actually looking really good. It's still a bit big. I measured it, I think it's about 20 thousandths. I think we're at 1.27 thereabouts. So I've tried to lower this by about 20 thousandths, and I'm going to hit it again and just kind of show you how it works. think that's it. As you saw, the cylinder fits on there just snugly, which normally I would think that would be too tight because there wouldn't be room enough for grease, but this is a self-lubricating bushing, so when you squeeze it, oil comes out, and you can actually see these dark spots on the surface here where it has left some oil behind. So those will be the high spots, I guess. It's not perfect, but it is much better than it was when I started, and I think it'll work. I'm extremely interested to see how this repair holds up in the longer term. This side was exactly the same, so I did the exact same thing to it. I did end up adding a grease fitting to each cylinder. There's another identical one on the other side. Just did that because it was really easy to do with the cylinders already off, and I figured better safe than sorry. So now I'm nearly ready to put the boom back on. There's one minor issue that I need to address. These pins here are just a little bit loose. It's not really loose enough to justify a serious repair, but I do want to do something about it because, as you can see here, it is enough play to walk around and kind of crush the end of this retainer that goes on there. You can see how the end is jagged because it's broken off. So I'm going to use some of this retaining compound. This is Loctite 638. So you just squirt this over it and it hardens into like an acrylic type substance. Loctite makes a ton of different compounds very similar to this. As far as I know, the only significant difference is how big of a gap they're designed to take up. This one is advertised as up to a 10,000ths of an inch gap, and I think, if I measured correctly, we should have about 5 to 7 thousandths, because it was about 10. I think that one was 10 thousandths of slop on the diameter, and this one was about 15 thousandths. So apparently the stuff needs to be in contact with metal and not in contact with air in order to cure, which is kind of interesting. I got the boom cylinder pins back in, so last but not least, I need to address the tilt cylinder. This end is fine, but this end was run without a pin for some time, and it has been hammered into an oval shape. This is the bushing that's meant to go in it, and maybe I can hold this to where you can kind of see how it is loose on the top and bottom and too tight on the sides. What I'm going to try to do is pull the rod out, take the piston off, heat up this eye, and just squish it back a little bit to get it close to round, and then bore it out, weld it up, bore it out again, and hopefully that will fix it. I think I understand how this comes apart. I put this in the press and pushed the gland in just a fraction of an inch, and I think it will turn now. Why? Just why? And that's what it looks like. It did end up kind of oblong, but the hole is in line with the rod, so it shouldn't really matter. It should just be cosmetic. There is quite a few inclusions in there, which I'm not sure how that happened, because it looked really good when I was welding it up, so I don't know where those came from, but I'm just going to roll with it. Worst case scenario, it breaks off and I replace it. So if you ever come across one of these lock wire cylinders, this is kind of how they're supposed to work. There is a groove in the gland here, as you can see, with a little hole in it. And then there is a corresponding groove that you probably can't really see in the cylinder barrel that matches up with this slot right here. And you'll have this square lock wire piece here with a little bent end on it right there. And you stick that through the slot into the hole and then turn it, and it will drag itself in, and you can see how it just fits about halfway into the groove on the gland and halfway into the groove in the barrel, and it locks the assembly together. I'm going to try to help myself out a little bit here and smear some anti-seize lubricant on this, so the next time I have to take it apart, hopefully it won't be quite so difficult. How did this go together? Let's see. Yeah, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. There's still a mountain of little things to do on this thing, but that's got, I think, the hardest part out of the way is tightening up all those pivot points so the boom will work correctly. I would take this thing out and test it, but the undercarriage has been worn pretty much to the point of destruction, and while it will move under its own power, it really shouldn't be. So I'm probably going to work on that next, but this video is plenty long, I think. So I'm going to end it here, and thank you for watching. I almost forgot, I did some research to try to figure out what went wrong with this, and I am 99% sure that this piece is made out of a type of cast iron called ductile iron, or sometimes called nodular iron, because the carbon content in it is in the form of little nodules or lumps, rather than large flat flakes like it is in regular old gray cast iron. That is the common type you see that like frying pans and stuff are made out of. Apparently that makes it quite a bit stronger, and it is comparable in strength to cast steel, but it's significantly cheaper, so it's very common to see ductile iron parts on heavy equipment. Very brittle welds.